Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Fast Performance Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Cole Thomas. Now, on this week's episode, we have a very special guest, Mr. Bill Miller. Bill is a strength and conditioning coach out in the Chicago area. He's very big on social media. He's got a very nice little footprint that he's carved out for himself on the training space. On this week's episode, we will talk about common misconceptions that baseball players have when it comes to the strength and conditioning realm. We will talk about key physical attributes that baseball players need to work to achieve to perform at their highest possible level on the field and maintain their health. We talk about tracking progress in the weight room through things like key performance indicators. We will talk about balancing the strength versus power in the weight room, where we want to be really strong, but we also want to make sure we're developing our power. We talk about improving velocity and power through the weight room, which I know a lot of you guys are very intrigued by and want to know how to get better at. And then we'll finish up talking about how we balance the strength and power in the weight room, because obviously those are two very, different avenues and very different techniques that need to be utilized, but they all should work hand in hand. I know this is a really great episode for you guys to listen to. You'll get a lot of valuable information out of it. Let's go talk to Bill Miller. All right, Bill, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me.
So I've been a big fan of you on social media the last few years. I think everything that you post on Instagram and everywhere that you are is so valuable to high school guys, college guys, and maybe middle school guys if they're in that, watching everything that you do. So can you share your background and experience as a sports performance trainer and specifically in the context as a baseball trainer?
Yeah, so I think my story is pretty similar to a lot of other coaches where, we trained very hard back in high school and in college, and, we tried to go as far as we could in our own baseball or sport career, but it just didn't work out. That's my story. I tried very, very hard, and I worked hard at things that I thought were good, and they turned out to not be as beneficial or not get me as far as I had hoped to in my career. So a lot of the stuff that I've really dove into over the past 4 or 5 years or so since my baseball career ended was all about just how come why was I so strong in the weight room, but I wasn't fast out in the field? Why couldn't I throw very fast, but other kids that were much smaller and weaker than me, they could throw much faster? And all those other sorts of ideas that I've tried to really dive deeply into are all a result of the disappointments that I had in my own training back in the day. So obviously, the explosive stuff and all the experimental stuff that you see on social media, that's really why I'm so highly interested in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. No, that kind of just totally reminds me of what everything that I do here was spurned by dumbass high school coaches, and
yeah,
just I want to make guys so good that their high school coaches can't refuse to play you or not.
Right. Well, and so another interesting little thought, somebody was mentioning to me the one day about how a lot of the training that I do looks very risky. A lot of it looks like you could get hurt doing this, and it's yeah, but at the same time too, so many of the athletes I train are D3 college guys looking where they got only 1 or 2 years to either transfer up or try to play indie ball, or right. I have a lot of lower level professional guys that are trying to make it still. So it's those riskier forms of training are probably going to be more applicable for them than maybe the kid who's from Florida, who's a future D1 draft pick type kid. All he has to do is just make sure he doesn't get hurt in his training. That's a different route, obviously, that you would go down. So that's something that I like to lead off with people, is understanding that I'm from Chicago, where the talent level is much worse than Florida, Texas, Arizona, California. So you just got to remember that and keep that in context.
Hey, same issue here in Colorado, my guy.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Denver and Chicago, so similar in that aspect. So getting really into the heart of why I really wanted to have you on. I've wanted to have you on for a long time. But so we can go really into what guys are missing specifically, especially at the high school and the college level, because, You know it, I know it. When we talk to guys about their lifting schedules outside of a place like Fast or a place like your place, and you ask them like, "What's their training schedule look like?" It's like the most eye rolling, and just like, "What the hell do you think you're doing? Why are you trying to accomplish this?" So, what are kind of you think, in your opinion, as a actual strength coach? I'm just a measly little pitching coach. I know enough to be dangerous, but don't come to me for real advice. But what are some common misconceptions that you feel or miss that you encounter when training guys at the high school and collegiate levels?
Um, I guess like the first myth that comes to mind is about like how more work is always better. Like, oh, we need to spend an hour every day in the weight room and stuff like that. Because the problem is a lot of the quality of training goes in the tank. So the only thing that will move the needle, whether it's for strength or hypertrophy or power development, speed development, it's a high effort, high quality rep. And we just need to stack thousands upon thousands of those, right, in order to produce those adaptations that we want. Well, if I am just going to the gym and crushing a little bit of 20-pound dumbbell curls all the time and not really moving the needle in any direction, you're probably just wasting your time and burning a lot of calories, which I know for a fact kids are trying to eat as much as they can to gain weight. So if you're doing a little bit less calorie burning and doing a little bit more actual stimulating of rep or stimulating adaptations with those reps, then you're going to probably see the best results. So I guess that does lead to another myth, which is like everybody gains at the same rate. I mean, that's obviously not the case. And I think it's easy on social media to get caught up in like, oh man, this kid gained 10 miles per hour in a year. It's probably not going to happen for everybody. And in fact, I would bet that the kid that gained 10 miles per hour probably had something in him that he could have probably thrown harder in his original test. Or, he was just like the tallest, lankiest kid that just needed to lift a weight and eat a cheeseburger once, and he's going to gain velo. You know what I mean? So I think people need to understand that. And I'm guilty of this. Like, and I know plenty of other, good coaches that are guilty of this. We're going to post the guys that gained a ton because it gets clicks, it gets likes, it gets people interested in our training and stuff like that. And it's a cool story. But at the same time, you always have to keep that in mind that, like, just because this kid from Wisconsin gained a bunch of velo right away with the same program that you're doing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are automatically going to gain that type of velo. So everybody gains at different rates, even if the program they're doing is just as good or just as beneficial as somebody else.
What do you think is that, I find it so many times, especially with high school guys, it's that they understand they need to get big, they need to put on some mass, but it comes from the wrong sources or the wrong areas. Like, I feel like too many people are, for like Chris Bumstead, the bodybuilder who's won Mr. Olympia, I don't know how many times, but it's how many people are so kind of inspired by him.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like, hey, do you think Chris Bumstead can throw a ball 90 miles an hour? Probably not. Like, out here, 45 minutes north of us is Brian Shaw, the 4-time world's strongest man who lives not too far from here. But I'm like, could he swing a bat, 50 miles an hour or whatever? I need to talk to our hitting coaches about that. But, could he swing a bat hard to produce a good exit velocity? Like, probably not. That's just not how they're built. But there's that impression that they need to look like a C-Bum or a Brian Shaw, but obviously those don't correlate to the sport that they play. It's just like a get big by any means necessary. Do you think is kind of the lining of the logic?
Yeah, and to be honest, I have grown very much away from that hypertrophy is really that beneficial for baseball players as far as like direct hypertrophy training goes. Over the years, I've gone away from it, and I'm starting to get back into it a little bit, mostly because it's that time of year where high school kids are coming in a lot more often now. So you kind of start to like, oh yeah, this kid really needs hypertrophy bad because he weighs 130 pounds. But I would say like the way that you go about it needs to be the most efficient way possible while always addressing power and speed. Like if you get bigger, that's great, only if your power and speed go up as a result of it. As you were mentioning with all those bodybuilders, at some point in their training, they were no longer getting that quality of rep that impacts speed and power development at a high level. So they got bigger, but they didn't get faster. That's the main problem, right? To me, the way that those reps should really look, the first thing that should happen in your training is that number one, speed training has to be the first thing that happens in a non-fatigued state. So if, let's say, we're going to crush legs today, boys, your sprints and your jumps had better come first so that we're stimulating good adaptations with those sprints and jumps. Obvious, okay?
Yeah.
Now we're going to go to our leg crushing day. We're going to do a bunch of squats, deadlifts, lunges, and stuff like that. I would recommend doing the power or more raw strength work first, and then cap off the day with those more crushing sets that maybe you get a little more fatigue from, and that produces the hypertrophy. Do that at the very end of the week. Do that when you know you have 2-3 days of rest to fully recover, and then do your speed work, power work, and hypertrophy work in that order. If you do it like that, I think you're going to see some really good results. But where kids will screw up is like, oh, I'm going to crush legs today, and then I'm going to run 15 sprints at the end of the session. It's like none of those sprints will do a damn bit of good for you. So we have to make sure that we understand what reps are stimulating for certain adaptations. And then if you need to put on weight, do it in a way that isn't going to negatively impact the speed and power work that should have come first.
Right. So now, moving on, into your experience, what are some key physical attributes that you think high school guys and college guys should work to prioritize in their training routines?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Like, I like to break things down into accelerators and decelerators. And so we had talked a little bit about off air about KPIs, or key performance indicators. So for those accelerators, a great KPI would be like a rotational medicine ball throw velocity. So whatever we do in the weight room, whether it's bench press, landmine press, lat pull down or pull up, or whatever you're choosing to do for those exercises, you would better make sure that your KPI is improving. So if it's a rotational medicine ball throw, I want to make sure I'm throwing that ball harder or farther every single week whenever I do find a time to test it. You would just want to make sure that those KPIs are improving. So the big ones that I like for baseball players are a rotational medicine ball throw, whether it be a shot put or a rotational lead arm throw, something like that. An overhead style throw, whether you're lying on your back or standing, an overhead medicine ball throw velocity is really, really good there. And then with the lower body, obviously a sprint, and then some sort of like a bouncy type jump, like a depth jump RSI, something like that. Those would be the main ones that you really have to hammer home with for those accelerators. And then for more of the decelerators, things like your torso has to decelerate effectively. So let's measure strength. I use crane scale to measure like a rotational isometric hold.
I see you use those all the time, and I kind of want to get one.
Love it. And I know there are better options out there, but they're just so expensive. Like a $50 crane scale makes so much more sense for me than buying a $700 or $800 isometric testing kit. So yeah, but the pal-off holds are some sort of rotational isometric for your core, basically. That trunk, that torso deceleration, and then like a shoulder-based internal and external isometric. Grip strength is pretty good as well for just for general like joint care, making sure that our body isn't breaking down when we're throwing. It's like continuously building for those joint stabilizers, if you will. So those are like the main testing things that I would say to do on a fairly frequent basis. And then, like I said, whatever you do for training, it could be all hypertrophy work, it could be all speed work, it could be in between, like what I like. If you are doing it in a way that those KPIs are improving, then you're on the right track and you're becoming a more powerful, more I don't like injury resistant baseball player, but you're ready to handle the rigors of throwing and swinging, basically.
How many like hours did it take to come up with all of your KPIs that you utilize the most?
A lot. I don't know. Let's see. So I have to give credit first to Chris Beardsley about the idea of like accelerators and decelerators, and I know he didn't come up with it necessarily, but he was like, look, like we like to look at sprinters in this way, where like there's acceleration and deceleration phases. These exercises correlate better with each of them. So I was like, oh, okay, I can just translate that to baseball and kind of do it like that. So I got to give credit to Chris Beardsley. I was in his mentorship program, I think about 4 years ago now when it first started. So he helped me out a ton. And then just with those sort of ideas that he sparked in my head, I was just like, okay, let's go. Let's try to test this thing out and see what happens. And then over the years, it just became more and more, I guess, standardized, if you will. Guys sort of know how to do it a little bit more effectively to where the numbers make a little bit more sense.
Right. So having read, like I've read your books, I've followed you on social media for a few years now, but for guys who maybe that don't follow you or have not read your books, what are kind of like that? What are the KPIs? Like what are the standards that you're kind of looking to achieve? Something like the med ball shot put rotation.
So fortunately we have a Proteus now, so I really don't do as much med ball testing as I used to. But I remember the big one was we used to do a med ball shot put with like 4-pound and a 6-pound ball. And if you could throw in a like more of a hitter's style start where you're not really diving forward with your chest, if you could throw the 6-pound ball over 30 miles per hour and the 4-pound ball over 34 miles per hour with the hitter's style shot put, that was elite. I was like, yeah, you're going to be super explosive in the batter's box if you can figure it out there. And then with the overhead throw, it was a little bit higher. It was like with the 6-pound ball, I think it was like 35 miles per hour with like a step overhead. And with the 4-pound ball, it was like almost 40 miles per hour, which was, that was like, okay, if you could do this, you could probably throw a baseball about 90 off the mound. So those
your lats are good.
Yeah, those are like the big ones that I remember. But what I really started to find interesting with the med ball throws was how there was different ways to go about testing it. And one way was doing it more from like a dead start, like just accelerate it, right? Like a hitter has to accelerate from more of a dead stop. Whereas a pitcher really uses that elasticity, right? So allowing guys to sort of take the ball, whip it back a little bit, and see if they were better like doing it like that was cool to see. So if your numbers really spiked when you were doing like a stretch shortening cycle type throw, that was cool to see. And I was like, yeah, like we want this. Like we want to make sure that you're applying this in your training more often because that's, in my opinion, will be most impactful for a throw. So there's different ways to do it, obviously, but that's just something that I've found over the years as well.
Yeah. So now there's always this interesting like argument, like people will say like at what point from your experience, because since strength training is such a foundational, or should be at least a foundational part of your overall baseball training as well, and obviously for some reason I don't know why guys kind of put that on the back burner for like they're like, I get so many guys who come in as like fix my mechanics, fix my fastball and all that. But like you said, like the kid's 140 pounds and I'm like, I can fix your mechanics, but it's not going to make a difference. I could do all these things. It's not going to make a difference. But what's your approach to getting these kids to understand the weight room is so valuable? And at what point do you think it should become a focus for them?
Well, what I try to tell them is like, look at the pro and MLB guys that come in here. Like, just look at them. What do they look like? Yeah. They're all they're tall. They're like 6'2" for the most part, but they're all pretty jacked. Like they're all 215, 220 pounds. The one guy's a little smaller in stature, but he's ripped. So like he's about 190, 200 pounds, like really solid built. So it's like until you look like that, the weight room matters a lot. And if you don't look like that at all, like look, the ultimate goal is not just to be a kid that like plays a little bit on your team. The goal is to be a kid that like grows, destroys at a current level, plays at the next level in college, and could potentially play pro ball. Like that should be your goal. So if you're not there yet, let's keep working on it. You know what I mean? Like it's very obvious what you need. So that's kind of my thing. And usually for the most part, after about 4, maybe 5 years of really consistent weight training, like let's say you started as like a sophomore in high school, by the time you're a sophomore in college, if you did it right, you should be looking more like those guys. Like you should be pretty built by that point. And then it's like, okay, like we should really be looking at your force velocity profiles now. Like we should really be looking to see like what we need to work on next, because it's going to take you probably another 2-3 years to really tap out everything that you can on the strength and hypertrophy end, where maybe in the next year or two, we can tap into some speed training that could take you to the next step. So that's what I would say. Like just use your eyes, and it's obvious. It's right in front of you. But The other thing that I would say is, for the most part, everybody that comes in is going to have a majority of their training be looking like this. It'll be one or two speed exercises, and everything else in the program is going to look like a lot of strength-based work, right? Whether it be isometrics, eccentrics, or general strength training. So that's what it's going to look like. And if you just did it like that, I think you're going to see gains for a very long time, as long as you continue to push those boundaries in each area. So if you're doing that for a couple months and your speed training just isn't going better in spite of your strength going up, then maybe, yeah, we need to do a little bit more speed work. But that's a really simple way to do it as well. Just stress what you think is going to work. And if you're testing enough, you'll see if it's working. And then just use basically, basically use the measurements as your guide.
Right. So when you're really famous for your approach to medicine ball training, and like you said, like I like your, make sure you're testing. So using things like with the medicine ball training, how often do you incorporate that test and retest method? Like, obviously from like the first get-go, the first time you see a kid, I'm imagining you're like, all right, now it's for the use the Proteus. I really want one of those. It's just way too damn expensive. You measure that, but how often are you remeasuring or retesting?
I would say you're probably going to be I would say every 3 to 4 weeks if you're a very beginner level, like never really strength trained before. There's not really a point in doing a lot of speed work if you're a true beginner in the weight room, because it's like you've never had this stimulus before. So we're going to see a ton of gains just by doing weight room stuff. But then I would say after that true beginner stage, you're going to probably want to test about once a week if you can. Mostly because, and this sounds counterintuitive, but testing in season. A lot of people don't do this, but I think it's huge. We started doing it with a high school sophomore I had last year, and we didn't do it his freshman year. And so we're like, hey, wait a minute. We're testing these med ball throws. Like, he was just doing it on his own. And I was like, dude, your numbers are in the tank right now. What's happening? Well, I just threw 7 innings yesterday and blah, 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 blah. It's like, okay, you had better double down on your recovery because you have 2 days before your next game. So if you're not getting these numbers back to at least baseline, you're not going to be ready to play very well, are you? And he's like, oh, this makes sense. So he started sleeping better. He started eating better. He started tracking those numbers. And throughout the season, the numbers stayed about the same. But just by tracking them, he didn't lose a lot of those gains that he had made in the offseason. So it's like, that's a huge thing. And people really need to start thinking about that a lot more, like measuring a KPI in season. It's not just for the offseason. It matters. You know what I mean?
All right. You take that as word of advice to the guys who train here. Come here in season. It really helps.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing. It's probably the same thing in Chicago, right? Where you get everybody in basically October all the way through March, and because everyone has to be indoors anyway, just like here. But then once March comes, what percentage of guys just kind of vanish off the face of the earth when the baseball season starts?
Right. Yeah.
And then they come back in the fall. And it's like, well, I started out really well, and then as the season progressed, and then the summer progressed, I felt worse and worse and worse. I'm like, I wonder why.
Yep. Exactly.
So, what are your touches on some in-season stuff, some out-of-season stuff, but what are and everyone's always looking for throwing harder. Everyone's always looking to hit the ball harder. What are some advice that you would give to guys while making sure they can avoid overuse injuries? And I always just say if you want to avoid overuse injuries, what I say, the weight room is the place to avoid those injuries. And other than avoiding really dog shit coaches who will pitch you more than you need to be, but I always say, the great equalizer in baseball is going to be guys who take the weight room seriously, especially at the amateur levels.
100%.
So when you're trying to avoid, I don't want to say avoid injury, but it's minimize the risk of the injury, because obviously you can't avoid it. But what are ways to, especially with the weight room, improve your velocity or improve your hitting speed while making sure you stay as healthy as possible?
Well, number one, the huge thing, kids always just want to bench, but you have to work your back. You have to work those decelerators. It's imperative. in my opinion, the accelerators like the chest, stuff like that, like you want those to be strong, but we need the decelerators to be like twice as strong. Like those have to accept the force. So if you're not working those as hard as you possibly can, you're really screwing up, because a lot of times kids treat like a dumbbell row like it's just an accessory exercise. I get through my 3 sets of 10 and I go home. No, like you should be pushing the boundaries with your rows, probably more than the bench press. You know what I mean? So that's just something that pops up all the time, and I see it and it drives me nuts. So like work your decelerators hard in the weight room, because if you do that, you can maintain the same level of velocity as before, but you're going to be able to be healthier now, and you're going to resist that injury, so you can continue to throw more frequently. That's huge.
Are you a fan of, I forget who was I know Cressy's talked about it in the past before, but it's that 2-to-1 ratio on accelerator muscles versus decelerator muscles. I'm assuming you would subscribe to that line of thinking.
Yes, and I've been thinking about that a lot. In my opinion, from a raw strength perspective, that is 100% the way that I like to go about it. Now, maybe from a pure reps perspective, maybe not, because with those accelerators, I would probably say we'll do some strength work, but we're going to do a lot of speed work with those muscle groups too. Whereas with the decelerators, we maybe won't do as much really speed work. We'll do a lot of like eccentric strength and isometric strength, along with more traditional types of strength training exercises. So that's the way that I like to go about it. But yeah, it's important for sure. But yeah, I mean, you got to push the boundaries. Like, don't really just like, you should never have a day in the weight room unless it's just like a recovery type day. You know what I mean? You should never have a day on your weight room, on your schedule, where it's just like, well, I'm not going to go heavier than last week. I'm not going to try to do more reps than last week. I'm just going to basically do what I've been doing, because if you go down that route, you're going to have a month or 2 months where you really haven't made progress, and it's just, you don't have that type of time, I guess, to really develop like that, if you think about it. But I guess the last sort of part to answer your question, another big thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how little throwing can we do and still make velocity progress, right? Because of all the injury risk factors in baseball, throwing a baseball is always going to be the highest injury risk. And I know that people want to argue about other crap, like this is why elbow injuries are going through the roof. It's just they're doing the risky thing, right?
Right.
Well, obviously as a big leaguer, that's what you have to do. But as a high school kid, you should be throwing a baseball. That's obvious. Like, you should have a decent level of throwing throughout the year. That makes sense. You should never have a huge spike in workload. But you should be trying to gain as much as you can in the weight room and with power development type exercises, because if you gain in those two areas, throwing is naturally going to increase, the velocity at least. And so now if you're doing the opposite, let's say, oh, I'm going to do a weighted ball throwing program and all this other stuff. The weighted ball isn't what's going to kill you. It's a super big spike in volume and not enough work in the weight room to match that, basically. So, yeah, that's kind of the way that I like to think about it, is like, you got to throw, but throw like the least effective dose, if that makes sense. Obviously, and as it leads into the season, you just increase your volume to an area that makes sense.
Right. No, like, I've always been a big subscriber, and Jason, my boss, he's an Alan Jaeger disciple. So it's kind of like working in the throwing more in certain aspects, and then melding that into the actual lifting. Right. 100%. So I find that it's such a, like, you need to throw, you need to condition your arm to maintain that level of throwing, while making sure, like, using the weight room that basically provides the floor for everything that you do.
100%, yeah.
So we messed around a little bit with the upper body, but now let's go into a little bit more of the lower body, which I think is kind of where power really originates, right? We have always start from the floor up. You mentioned a lot and talk a lot about the significance of lead leg stabilization, which I'm a huge on for guys. Like, you need to have your lead leg be solid and stable and strong, or you're just not going to throw hard. And then it comes into some hip extension power. What are some recommended drills or specific exercises that you think guys should utilize more often to maximize those gains in lead leg blocking and extension in the hips?
Yeah, so obviously, like, the most popular one is the reverse lunge. But the way that I like to use it is more so with just like, I'm more of a fan of a rear foot elevated Bulgarian split squat. But regardless of what you do, I like using either pins where you start the bar from the pins and drive up from there, or use a slightly lighter load than you would think and go for a bar speed PR. Those are the two
Yeah.
things, because I've seen it over the years, man. The reverse lunge is a cool exercise, but when you're going for a 1 rep max, it's a nightmare. Not only does it have a huge injury risk involved compared to a lot of other weight training exercises, it's also just like getting, like, the form is really sloppy, and then it's like it takes all of your energy that you could have spent on other things. It saps all of it. Like, it takes 45 minutes to get a reverse lunge 1 rep max. So understand that those exercises are good, but there are better ways to do them than simply just, let's go, bro, 1 rep max, 90-mile-per-hour formula. You know what I mean? So there are better ways to do it. But the other way that I like a lot for strength testing is taking the crane scale and doing a split squat type isometric pulling on the crane scale. That one is cool.
Do you anchor it to the floor, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, we have a squat rack bolted to the floor, and we just kind of hook it into a pin there, and it works extremely well. Big fan of it. So if you have like that setup, that would be, in my opinion, much better than a 1 rep max test. Much safer and probably just as effective from a high threshold motor unit recruitment standpoint.
Right.
And then for more of the speed type exercises, weighted jumps are actually something I've gotten more of a fan of over the years. What I've really been getting into is using like a dead start for those weighted jumps. And then when we want to use the stretch shortening cycle, just unload it and get super bouncy. Like, so sprints, depth jumps where we're hopping off of a box and trying to spring off the ground as quick as we can. We have little jump sensors that you can test that with. Obviously, you can test sprint speed with a stopwatch, but doing those types of, springy type fast activities is a great way to train the ability of that lead leg to sort of rapidly absorb that force and like get it going back up the kinetic chain. So I'm a big fan of that as well. And that's not to say that to throw hard you have to be a great sprinter, but I would say like 9 times out of 10, if you're like a bad sprinter and you throw mediocre, like 85-ish, and I turn you into a great sprinter and you improve all your other areas pretty well, like, you're probably going to throw a lot harder. So that's something like I know Zach from TCU used to talk about a lot. And since we started incorporating it a couple years ago, pitchers have gotten a lot more athletic, and it's just like, it makes a lot of sense.
It definitely helps to be an athlete.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So balancing power and strength, which is always an interesting dynamic with strength coaches. And I know our strength coaches here are, I like to say they're always the best because I think they've done a really good job. But we utilize things like Kaiser machines and all sorts of technology and gadgets. But there's a balance that has to be, especially for beginners, where you have to balance. I want to get really, really strong, but I also want to get some speed and get some power. What is the balancing act to making sure guys are gaining strength while also exploiting more power?
There's a lot of different routes that you can go. Like I was talking about before with the KPIs, you do your basic strength training program and maybe test once a week those explosive type movements. That's one way to do it, and I've done that before. It works well. The other way to do it is simply use those explosive exercises as like a potentiation or warm-up type movement for your weight training. So, for example, I just had a guy earlier who was doing pin press. We did Proteus shot put right before that. So you do an explosive press, and then I'm not saying you have to superset or anything. Just do 2 or 3 sets of the explosive press. Oh, wow, numbers are looking good today. Let's go bench. Let's go do our heavy press, and then you go through that. And I think that works really well. You don't have to do a ton of it, just a few sets, and see what your numbers are looking like, and just kind of use it like that. I think it makes a lot of sense, because if your Proteus numbers suck today or your med ball numbers suck today, and you got to go hit a heavy bench day, you're probably not going to bench very well. So why not actually take that time to stimulate that nervous system, get really explosive, and then, oh, I'm going to go hit some PRs on the bench. I'm going to get better than I did last week. That kind of gets the ball rolling in that direction.
Right. So now we've talked plenty about like all the off-season stuff, and obviously our progression in the off-season is we can spend a lot more time in the weight room in the off-season, getting bigger, getting stronger, getting more powerful, faster. But when the spring rolls around, what are some strategies for high school guys and college guys? Because I feel most guys, college is a little easier to deal with because they have their strength coaches, they have their weight room, and college guys are just different animals from high school guys in that respect. But especially for the high school guy, and this is something we run into a lot all the time here, I'm sure you run into it out there, is I don't have time to get into the weight room, or I don't have time to do this, I don't have time to do that. But what are some strategies that like, here's like the easiest bang for your buck you can do with your limited amount of time, quote unquote?
It's not easy to really create those adaptations that you want with just body weight exercises. Like, it's simply not, especially if you're more of a developed high school kid. But I would say if you're going for hypertrophy or something like that, getting some sort of like a band resisted push-up would work pretty well. Some sort of a thick resistance band might work well too, or some sort of inverted row type exercise. Like, try to gain or maintain mass as much as you can, because for most of those kids, that's where all of their gains are going, right out the window. A nice little strategy that'll work. We tried this out last year and it worked okay. Taking one set basically till failure, whether it was like a band resisted close grip push up or like an inverted row. This kid set up a little like sort of bar in his house that he could pull himself up on with like an inverted row. Doing like just take one set to failure, even if you just did 3 sets of 10 and on your last one you got to 15 or 20 reps. It's not bad. It's not perfect, but it will stimulate enough of a hypertrophy adaptation to gain or maintain some weight. But yeah, other than that, like, it's going to be tough, man. Like, if you're not getting in the weight room, you're holding on by the skin of your teeth. You're not actually like making damn sure that you're going to maintain all those gains until you get back in the weight room.
Right. So you're very big on nutrition and recovery. You kind of, in one of your articles I read, is you like this guy is controlling the lowest hanging fruit, right? It's taking care. If you can take care of these small things, what are, for guys who are listening to this, what's the biggest, easiest to grab, lowest hanging fruit that guys just, they don't take advantage of enough? And you wish, like, if you just took advantage of this, like, you would see at least your floor for sure would be elevated.
I would say sleep is the biggest one. REM sleep, obviously. If you're not sleeping well, it doesn't matter what else you do. Like, nothing's going to come out fast. You're not going to be lifting more weight than before. Your body's going to start to deplete. Hydration is big too. A lot of kids don't realize how dehydrated they actually are, and how hydration isn't just you chug one big bottle in an hour and that's it for the day. It's 20 ounces or so every hour or two. Consistently hydrating throughout the day is probably going to be a lot more beneficial. And then nutrition. I'm not a nutritionist, but you can figure it out. Get enough calories and try to get them from the best possible sources. Like, try to get as many of those micronutrients as you can through every single piece of food that you put in your mouth. If you're putting food in your mouth that has a lot of calories but doesn't have a lot of micronutrients in it, let's try to find something better tomorrow. You know what I mean? It's not the end of the world if you're a skinny kid and you eat frozen pizza once a week, but it's a big deal if you're doing it 3, 4, 5 times a week, because you're going to feel like shit. You're not going to perform well. And that's the end result. We always want to feed and recover, sleep, hydrate, everything to perform well. And if you treat it like that, the recovery and the weight gain and all that stuff goes in the right direction.
Right. Where do you think, things like foam rolling or just fascia, like taking care of your muscles as well, or mobility kind of fits into that?
I don't know. Because the more you read on foam rolling, the less it's official. But here's what I'll say. Any time that you can sort of stimulate more blood flow into a certain area, even if it's like a blood flow restriction type thing. Now, I'm not saying like cut your legs circulation off completely or anything, but if you do find a way to get blood flow stimulated to an area. It could be acupuncture. Like my wife does
Right.
acupuncture and she loves it and I think the reason why, obviously there's a mental sort of effect to it, but I think it's blood flow. That's really it. And why is that? It's because when we eat nutrients, they go into our bloodstream. How do those nutrients go from bloodstream to muscle? We need more blood flow applied to the area. That's really my idea on it, to be honest with you. I don't think too much about it other than just, hey, try to get into that spot, try to dig into it type of thing. It might help a little bit, you know.
Right. So pulling it back into the weight room real quick, I wanted to ask about what are specific mobility and flexibility exercises you can do, because obviously the idea is the more range of motion you can generate, the more power you're going to be able to generate. What are like the biggest things you see that if you did maybe these specific exercises, that you're going to see big gains in your KPIs and then everything else that comes along with it?
Probably end range isometrics are the thing that come to mind. Like that's my go-to. And the reason why is because obviously we want to get into deep ranges of motion. Like getting stretchy is okay, but it's better to be strong in an end range, sort of range of motion. So if you can do a safe end range type movement, whether it be internal or external at the shoulder, I'm not trying to crank into my deepest range of motion. I'm just trying to get further and further and further each week, very slightly. And if I can produce a lot of force on the crane scale in that deeper position, it's probably a good sort of thing to have in your arsenal, if you will. So that's the way that I like to approach it. It works especially well with like the hips and the hamstrings, not just stretching them, but actually pushing into an immovable object or something like that. So that's kind of my little mobility shtick, if you will.
You're just hammering away. There's a difference between being flexible and being mobile.
100%.
Which I think guys will make that mistake of like, oh, I can touch my toes, and like, well, congratulations, but what does that do for you?
Right.
Or I get really good external rotation in my shoulder, but then I look at a kid, I take his video when I do an assessment on him, he still has a high hand. He's not getting maximum way back in his throw. You have the flexibility to do that, but it's not a strong apparatus. The shoulder's not strong in any way.
100%. That's very well said. Yeah.
But yeah, taking away, one thing I find, and I think guys can really benefit from, is this idea of mental conditioning while doing their baseball training. Like, how do you incorporate any kind of like mental skill work, like other than just, hey, move bar fast and like,
that's really it.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, man, I think the reason that a lot of the kids that come through here would get mentally tougher if they do, it's because they're just competing with each other and just talking shit all the time. You know what I mean? That's honestly though, that's what I see with these kids. Like, I do see them becoming more confident and that sort of thing when they're just like, they're working out in a group of 3 guys and they're all just jawing at each other, trying to get each other better, that sort of thing. I do think that actually pays off dividends. As far as like working it to the bone and you're about to throw up at the end of the session, I don't think I've ever seen a kid throw up in here. So, and I don't ever want to. So, I don't think.
Well, And when I look at the mental skills or just training in general, is understand like there's just going to be how do you compete or how do you find an edge when maybe you just don't have it that day? Like, how many guys do you find will not hit their KPIs that day, but they find a way to just like, all right, I'm going to get this workout done and I'm going to hit it as hard as I can. I'm capable of, right?
Right.
And that like maybe pushes them in the seasons like, okay, I know what it feels like to feel like dog shit, but now I got to go help my team or I got to go execute. Right. And they learn that through the weight room.
No, yeah, I agree 100%. And I think you really learn that when you're in like a small group where everybody really cares about making sure that you're getting better, you know what I mean? And stuff like that. And I just think by being in that environment on a daily basis, instead of just being, maybe on your own working out or something like that, I think it's a completely different mental effect, if you will.
Right. So I got 2 more things for you, then I'll let you get back to training all all of Chicago's finest. And so what advice would you give to a high school or college athlete as we're now entering the off season in October, September, whatever month we're in now. But in terms of setting realistic goals for this off season, whether that be in the weight room or, obviously like a kid that benches 135, you're going to be hard pressed to bench 300.
Yeah.
Or you're going to get, or how can I get a kid to establish proper goals for this offseason, especially in regards to the weight room?
Well, when it comes to the weight room, just try to think about 5 pounds at a time. I know it sounds very lame. It doesn't sound very sexy, but if you say, I'm getting my next 5 pounds as fast as I can. And, so if it happens next week when I work out, 2 weeks from now, whatever it may be, I'm going to get that next 5 pounds, or I'm going to get that next rep or 2 per this set, whatever it may be, however you're doing your progressive overload. Think about it in short term. Don't just think about it in the bigger scale of things. Velocity is the exact same way. Don't think about it, I need to get 10 miles per hour this year. Think about it, I'm going to get a half mile per hour this month. And I know it sounds lame, but if you stack that up over 12 months, that's 6 miles per hour. That's about as much as I will ever see anybody gain in here. So it is lame to think about, but think about the next small little rung on the ladder that you can climb up on. If you think about it like that, I think you're going to probably see better results.
Right. So one last thing, and I ask everybody that's been on the show, is what is that big piece of advice that you would give to a kid? Obviously, like you said out in the opening, like I'm a kid that, why was this kid better than me when I put in so much goddamn work? And like how, through all the phases of everything you've seen as a strength coach, you've seen really good baseball players, you've seen really dog shit baseball players, you've seen, you work with high school guys, college guys, low-level pro guys like you mentioned before. But what is that big piece of advice that you would give to the high school, college guy around the country that maybe does not have the privilege of training with you?
I would say 100% measure the stuff that matters. Like, don't just focus on weight room 1-rep maxes. Don't just focus on getting huge. Those things are good, but make sure that your speed is always improving as a result of all of your work. Like, never, ever, ever let gains in the weight room or hard work in the weight room pay off for nothing. Like, it better be paying off, and you better be measuring to make sure that those results are happening in real time. That's my biggest thing that I missed out on for sure. And I think it's one of the bigger reasons why a lot of the guys I train have continued to climb over the years, even when the weight room stopped being as big of a part of their development.
Awesome. I like that. So, Bill, thank you so much for jumping on the show. Do you have anything to plug? How can people find you if they have not already found you with however many tens of thousands of followers you have now on social media?
On Instagram, it's at Bill Miller Training. I have a new book coming out, Testing is Training. And it's all about the stuff that we just talked about here. So it's a really, shameless plug, I guess, if you will. But that's
what this segment is here for.
Yeah, so that's going to be my third book now. I have Swing Fast, Throw Fast, and now this new book coming out in the next couple weeks. So whenever this podcast drops, make sure you reach out to me or look on my Instagram page. I'm making sure that I'll post it everywhere so you can go check it out.
Awesome. Don't you have a Patreon account that you use that, or do you still utilize that stuff?
Yeah. Patreon is at Bill Miller Training as well.
Nice. Bill Miller, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to meet you. It was a pleasure to get to pick your brain on a lot of the stuff in the training space. Like I said, I know enough to be dangerous, but if anyone came to me like real advice on that shit, I'd be like, I don't know, go talk to our strength coaches in the other room. They know way more than I do.
No, for sure. But yeah, man, this was great. Thank you so much for having me on.
And that will wrap up another week of the Fast Performance Baseball Podcast. Thank you so much to Bill Miller for coming on the show. I really appreciate him coming on. I thought he brought in a lot of valuable insights for not only me that I can use for the training for the rest of the year as the fall gets ready to get kicking on, and for you guys to learn, how to approach your strength training strategies if you don't already have a trainer. Be sure to go follow him on Instagram if you don't already, at Bill Miller Training on Instagram and at Bill Mills on Twitter. Be sure to go buy Swing Fast and Throw Fast. Those are two different books. Make sure to go buy those. I have Throw Fast. I highly recommend it. I think it's a phenomenal resource. And then be on the lookout for Testing is Training, Bill's third book that will be coming out at some point later this year. I want to thank you guys for tuning into the show. Really appreciate you guys' support. Be sure to like this video and then share it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I look forward to seeing you all next time.